As you guys know, UFC 313 is right around the corner, and that card will be headlined by Alex Pereira versus Magomed Ankalaev, which is an amazing fight in the UFC light heavyweight division. But to go along with this, the co-main event of UFC 313 will be an absolute banger matchup between Justin Gaethje versus Dan Hooker, and analyzing this co-main event will be the focus of today's video. And I will be explaining why I will be picking Justin Gaethje to defeat Dan Hooker, and why this is an easier matchup for Justin Gaethje on paper than what most people may lead you to believe. But there is a sad truth that must be considered when picking Justin Gaethje to win this matchup that could in fact lead to the downfall of his entire career, which I will elaborate on after analyzing the basic elements of this matchup. So, hopping straight into analyzing Justin Gaethje's style, Justin Gaethje's fighting style has a number of fundamentals that Justin Gaethje does extremely well, starting with his leg kicks. While Justin Gaethje is not as recognized for his leg kicking ability today like he was when he first got into the UFC, Justin Gaethje still has very good leg kicks. His leg kicks are extremely damaging, precise, and he throws them at a very high volume. But above all, he throws these kicks with very good timing, with footwork that avoids telegraphing the leg kicks incoming in the first place. And this makes his leg kicks extremely difficult to check for his opponents. When you look at Justin Gaethje's leg kicking stats, he always lands at over a 50% clip rate, and that shows that his opponents are not able to read the leg kicks, and they're not able to get together a proper defense to defend the leg kicks. Even when you look at the fights that Justin Gaethje has lost, for example, his most recent fight against Max Holloway, the leg kicks were his most damaging weapon, and probably the only thing that kept him really competitive in that fight in the beginning rounds. So Justin Gaethje's leg kicks are a really reliable source of offense for him, and I think that the leg kicks, they can change this fight if he implements them the right way. Since the leg kicks are so damaging, it creates openings for Justin Gaethje to implement his devastating KO power, which is the second thing that he's going to be bringing into this fight against Dan Hooker. Justin Gaethje is famous for his ability to knock out his opponents. He has over 20 knockouts in his entire career, and his knockout power is what makes him such a good UFC fighter. Part of that knockout ability might just be genetic. He might have just been born with that type of power in his hands, but I truly believe that a good portion of the reason why he's knocking out so many of his opponents is because of his competence in the realm of striking and his excellent counter-striking ability, which could be seen in multiple knockouts that he has over the course of his entire career. His counter-striking ability is extremely underrated, and I think that is going to be a huge factor to consider when you're picking Justin Gaethje to defeat Dan Hooker. And before we get into the Dan Hooker section, I just want to mention that there are certain mistakes that Dan Hooker makes in his fights that I believe that Justin Gaethje, he will be able to take advantage of using his excellent counter-striking. But there are numerous examples that we can look at that shows how Justin Gaethje excels not just in the realm of striking, but in the realm of counter-striking when his opponents are trying to overwhelm him with a barrage of punches. We can look to his excellent performance against Michael Chandler. We can look to his knockout against James Vick. Justin Gaethje was able to land that beautiful counter shot on the chin of James Vick. Or we can look to the Tony Ferguson bout where he was the first person to snap the 12-fight winning streak of Tony Ferguson. And we can see the excellent counter-striking in round 5 of that fight, where Justin Gaethje was just absolutely brutalizing Tony Ferguson and exploiting the mistakes that Tony Ferguson constantly makes in his defensive guard. Another thing that Justin Gaethje brings to the table is his good defense. Now, his defense can be questionable at some moments of his fights, but generally, Justin Gaethje is a pretty defensively sound fighter, and I think that his defense is kind of underrated. Like Justin Gaethje, he's not a defensive juggernaut like a Sean Strickland or anything, but generally, Justin Gaethje protects himself really well, and he uses a tight high guard to protect himself, and he tucks his chin very good too. Now, I know what you're thinking. There are a lot of moments that you can point to in Justin Gaethje's career where he gets knocked out or gets knocked down really bad too. For example, you can obviously point to the Charles Oliveira fight where he almost gets like thrown across the cage. You can even point to the Eddie Alvarez matchup where he takes that brutal knee right to the chin and gets brutally dropped. But in most of those instances, Justin Gaethje, he's kind of going all in with a live by the sword, die by the sword type of mentality. When Justin Gaethje is trying to be more technical and kind of patient, we're going to get to that in the next point. I think that Justin Gaethje, his defense holds up really well, and he is a very underrated fighter when it comes to his defensive integrity. Now, the next skill that Justin Gaethje has, and a skill that I think truly is why he is one of the most elite lightweights in the UFC, and that is because he is now patient and he can now pick his shots properly and use his striking in a very effective manner. We mentioned before that Justin Gaethje, he has very good striking, but I believe now it is his patience that he has incorporated rather recently is what makes him such a formidable opponent. And I think this patience is going to play a huge role in this fight. Justin Gaethje, in his earlier career coming up in the UFC, he liked to get into brawls. He wasn't technical. His performances were not clean. Even though he won a lot of his fights, he was not as technical and his skills weren't as refined as he is today. Like, for instance, about a year ago, he knocked out Dustin Poirier, which is a very spectacular win to have on your resume. Poirier is one of the best boxers, not only in the lightweight division, but almost in the entire UFC roster. So it takes a lot of skill to beat a fighter by knockout like Dustin Poirier. Now, when we move on to analyzing Dan Hooker's fighting style, Dan Hooker, he is mainly a striker as well, like Justin Gaethje, but Dan Hooker does have some grappling skill sets that he can use in this fight. And Dan Hooker's grappling is kind of underrated. But Dan Hooker for sure is a way better striker than he is a grappler. Dan Hooker has a kickboxing style and he throws a diverse array of punches, kicks, elbows. His elbows are really damaging. He has good Muay Thai fundamentals. I don't know if Dan Hooker trained Muay Thai before, but Dan Hooker, he has very good elbows and knees, and I think that Dan Hooker, he utilizes those fundamentals really well into his fights. When he fought Dustin Poirier, he always mixed up the striking, and he made that fight really competitive. But another thing that Dan Hooker does very well is his distance control and his footwork. Like I said, Dan Hooker, he is a really good striker. And part of being a good striker is knowing how to manage the distance between you and your opponent and using footwork to not only set up strikes, but to make sure you're moving effectively around the cage. And Dan Hooker does these two things very well. And that's what really backs up his really good striking on the feet is his distance management and footwork. Another thing that you must talk about when you're describing Dan Hooker's fighting style is his pressure and cardio. In his most recent fight, the amount of pressure that he was putting on Gamrot in the third round, that was like the deciding factor of an entire fight. And Dan Hooker, he pressures his opponents, and that pressure is backed up by his amazing striking. So really, a lot of what Dan Hooker does very well, it all leads back to his amazing striking. And along with that pressure, he has very good cardio. That allows him to go 5 rounds with Dustin Poirier. And that allows him to constantly walk down his opponent like he did against Gamrot. And another thing that Dan Hooker brings to the table is his chin. Dan Hooker can really take a punch. I think he's only been knocked out a couple times. Off the top of my head, I believe Michael Chandler knocked him out, and I think Arnold Allen TKO'd him, but that was at featherweight. But other than that, I believe that Dan Hooker, he has never been like flatline KO'd or anything like that. And considering how much he pressures his opponents, that shows that he's a very seasoned fighter in the realm of striking to just not get put out cold, even though he's constantly being in his opponent's face. Now, when we talk about the matchup that will be happening at UFC 313 between Justin Gaethje and Dan Hooker, I believe on paper, Justin Gaethje, he is the person to beat Dan Hooker. Justin Gaethje, like I said, he has the power in his hands to knock out Dan Hooker. And on top of that, Dan Hooker can be a marauder in some cases. For example, I keep bringing up the Gamrot fight, but that Gamrot fight, it showed Dan Hooker's good side and it showed his bad tendencies as well. And one of the bad tendencies that fight showed was that in that third round, Dan Hooker, yes, he was walking down Gamrot, but he had his hands by his side and he was not being defensively responsible. So someone like Justin Gaethje, who is a good counter striker, he can easily catch Dan Hooker on the chin. And when you have the power of Justin Gaethje, it doesn't matter if you have a good chin like Dan Hooker, you're going to go out. I can just see Justin Gaethje winning by a knockout. I can even see Justin Gaethje winning by a decision. Because, let's be honest, Dan Hooker, he is on a 3-fight win streak. But you have to consider that he is not just tearing through his opponents like Khamzat Chimaev. He's not just buzzsawing through Jalen Turner. He's not crushing Mateusz Gamrot. Most of the fights on that win streak, he won by a split decision. I believe the first fight, I forgot who it was against. I think it was Claudio Puelles. I think he finished that fighter by a body kick TKO, I think. And other than that, his last two fights in the lightweight division, he has won by split decisions. And Justin Gaethje, he is an elite lightweight, even though he got knocked out by Max Holloway in his most recent fight. We'll talk about that a little later. But Justin Gaethje, he's still a part of that elite guard of the lightweight division between Dustin Poirier, him, and Oliveira. And Gaethje, yes, he's getting old, but I still think that he has the power in his hands to knock out someone like Dan Hooker. But for my official early prediction for this fight, I think that Justin Gaethje, he can probably win this fight by a decision. When it comes to Justin Gaethje, a lot of people underestimate him, especially when he's coming off of a loss. I remember when he got knocked out and submitted against Charles Oliveira, people were really doubting him against Fiziev, and he came out there and outstruck Fiziev to a decision. So I think that Justin Gaethje, I can see him winning this fight by a decision as well. But as the title of this video insinuates, there is a sad truth to this matchup. And this is going to be about Justin Gaethje. And it's obvious what the elephant in the room is. And that is Justin Gaethje, he got KO'd brutally against Max Holloway in his most recent fight. And not only did he get KO'd brutally, he got his nose broke horribly. And that is going to come into this fight. And we've seen from prior fighters that when you have your nose damaged that bad, a lot of fighters, they don't take damage the same for the rest of their career. We've seen that with Rory McDonald. After that fight against Robbie Lawler, his career kind of fell off a cliff because of how much damage he took to that particular area. And Justin Gaethje, he really messed up his nose. And if he gets knocked out, it's going to be due to that nose. I know that Gaethje took a lot of time off, and I really think that is going to be in his favor for this upcoming fight. But Max Holloway could have effectively ended Justin Gaethje's whole career. Obviously, you have that brutal knockout, which is the highlight of that whole fight. But what people don't really talk about is how much damage Justin Gaethje took to his nose. And the sad truth about this matchup is I believe that if Justin Gaethje loses this fight by a TKO, I think that his career might actually be over in the lightweight division. And I think that Justin Gaethje, he should retire if he loses to Dan Hooker, especially if he loses by knockout. If he loses by a decision and he gets like technically just shut down in the striking, he might have a chance to go on like a resurgence run. But if Justin Gaethje gets TKO'd, especially if it's due to taking damage to that nose area, I think that Justin Gaethje, his career might be effectively over. But I still will be siding with Justin Gaethje against Dan Hooker. However, that is the sad truth that you must consider when you're judging this matchup.